Hello, and welcome to USAID Land Office's initial webinar on land tenure in Kosovo. We're pleased that you're joining us today and starting this series by looking at land tenure issues, forestry issues, water and mining issues in Europe's youngest country, Kosovo. During the presentation, you're free to send us questions. Please send them via Twitter using the hashtag #countrybycountry. And now let's get started. I'm going to introduce you to today's speaker and the author of the newly updated country profile on Kosovo, Dr. Maureen Moriarty-Lempke. Dr. Lempke specializes in land tenure and property rights issues, as well as resettlement issues in conflict-afflicted areas. She's done work in countries such as Afghanistan, Haiti, Kosovo, Liberia, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, and Ukraine. She's also served as a visiting lecturer at Duke University's program in international development policy. She's taught courses related to land, conflict mitigation, and the important connections between land tenure, property rights, and issues such as food security, climate change, natural resource management, and urban informal development. So we're very pleased to have her with us this morning for this discussion. Maureen, over to you.
Great, thank you, Carol. It's just a pleasure to be here, and I want to say a special hi to anyone who's tuning in from Kosovo. I always begin these sorts of discussions by saying, if you're from, for the people in country, is to please contribute, correct, and ask questions. This is where you come from, and I always feel a little bit as an outsider that I inevitably miss something, but I'm just really delighted everyone is here today to talk about the land tenure and property rights situation in Kosovo. So in the few minutes I have, what I'd like to do is just introduce you to the profile and what the profile contains in terms of the dimensions of land tenure property rights and the universe of land tenure property rights, and then take a look at the high-level tenure situation and some of the both the legal framework, land administration, and we'll take a peek at natural resources, as well as what the government and donor interventions are doing in those areas. And then I'd really just like to open it up for questions and comments. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the country profiles that USAID does, these are really pretty comprehensive, high-level looks at the land tenure situation. So this profile contains an overview, which are really the headlines of the state of the country, key macro indicators such as GDP, population, and land, then and indicators around natural resource use, specifically in the areas of water, trees, and minerals. And so section 1 is broken down into a discussion of land use, land distribution, which includes distribution of land holdings and appropriate disaggregation by ethnicity, age, and gender. And then the section continues with the types of tenure arrangements that are currently at work in Kosovo. It's land administration institutions, land markets, land administration, and as well as its rules on expropriation and acquisition. And section 1 concludes with some of the key government interventions in terms of land tenure over the last maybe 5 years. Section 2 addresses natural resources and specifically fresh water, which includes lakes, rivers, and groundwater, and the resource quality, use, and distribution. In each of those sections, the profile also covers what some of the government interventions and as well as donor interventions, who's doing what, where. And then section 3 describes the forest resources, their use, quality, and distribution in the same format the recent government interventions as well as donor interventions. And then section 4 concludes with an overview, again in the same format as water and forest resources, on mineral resources, their use, quality, distribution, as well as what government and donor interventions are taking place. So the document is about close to 30 pages long, with a lot of footnotes and resources for you to have if you want further reading. So just to give a very brief overview of what the current land tenure situation is that the main ways that people obtain land in Kosovo are through lease, purchase, inheritance, and gift. And unfortunately, there's really no national data that provides us with how people obtain land presently. And that securing those land rights is supported through pretty modern and egalitarian and robust land law, lots of improvements in the land administration system, and access to information about land rights. Again, the land law in Kosovo has really been described, in its evolution since 2008 as really modern and egalitarian. And it's really important to keep in mind that on paper we have really good land law. Of course, the gap exists in enforcement and understanding. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Those are who are most vulnerable from a tenure perspective are also those who are the most vulnerable economically, and hence we really need to that economic improvement in people's economic lives is really a function about their ability to access and use rights. And those who are really most vulnerable are women, ethnic minorities, and displaced people. And these groups face tenure insecurity mainly because they have problems either obtaining the appropriate records and papers to register their residences in cadastral office, and also because of a loss of land records during the war. For women, their continued insecurity around land and property rights is really a function of poor implementation and enforcement of what is pretty good law, and also traditional practices that women that women will often forfeit what their actual rights are in favor of a male relative or spouse. And the other piece that I would like to underscore is the fact that ethnic minorities have really been affected by displacement and the fact that there's been significant rural to urban migration post-war. People are really trying to go to more urbanized settlements in search of opportunities, but in doing so, they often establish housing in these informal developments, and these are characterized by a lack of access to basic services, water, infrastructure, adequacy of housing, and they're really not built in any kind of harmony with existing spatial plans within Kosovo. And because they're not registered in cadastral offices, they really face risk of eviction and really have a lot of tenure insecurity. So just a couple of the new laws and policies that I'd like to underscore in terms of enhancing and really underpinning the ability to secure land rights are the law on Cadastre, and that really regulates the country's cadastre of immovable property on a national level. And this legislation has not just been written, but really supported and enforced, and it has, in my opinion, at least gone a long ways toward ensuring that there's more accessible, secure, and accurate land data. And the government, to its credit, in Kosovo really placed early and consistent focus on this law and the implementation thereof. And in regards to women, the new law on gender inequality seeks to accomplish, to promote equality between gender as a basic value of the democratic development of a society. I think this law is really important because something like only 15% of women actually are registered as owners of property in Kosovo. And I think what the law does is really establish norms and values for women as legitimate landholders in society. There was a small survey done a few years back, and that survey showed that only 78% of women by household were registered as property owners. So there's certainly a long way to go, but the law and programs, donor interventions such as USAID's property rights program will go a long way, I think, in ensuring that happens. And speaking of the property rights program, I think it's worth noting that USAID has been a really early and consistent donor in terms of property rights. The PRP is a 4-year plan that seeks to address property rights challenges and to really develop a comprehensive property rights plan for Kosovo. And there's 4 pillars or 4 objectives of that particular plan, which is better coordination of policy and priorities, which is really intergovernmental coordination and harmonization of policies, improved court procedures for property claims for displaced and restitution claims, enhancing women's right to use and access land, and then improved communication, access to information, and understanding of property rights. And in my opinion, I think this is really key, is that people, whether it's women, minorities, the displaced, in terms of restitution, really understand what their rights are and how to access those rights and how to regain their property rights. So in terms of natural resources, I'd like to talk a little bit about the forestry sector, because this is a sector that offers tremendous promise, but has really been, is really threatened by illegal cutting and unsustainable forest use. That Kosovo has a rich history of use and cultivation of non-wood forest products, but for income generation, but the unclear forest ownership, selling forest products as raw materials, and a small number of processing and value-added dimensions to the timber industry have really have hurt the potential of the sector. And if I were to say what's the main process, the sort of high-level process that's happening in terms of forestry, it's really about decentralization and giving local communities more control over management of forest resources, and the local law and self-government really delegates that. But there have been inefficiencies in that process. Some of the forest laws have changed numerous times, and that there's just the proliferation of illegal logging. And unfortunately, some of the logging also takes place in the northern part of Kosovo, where there are contested areas, and what they call the gray zones, which is overlapping jurisdiction between the Serbian enclaves in the north and the more southern parts, but also neighboring countries. So that's one of the things I wanted to highlight. I think that if I had to give a headline about the forestry sector, it's really constrained by mechanisms that should encourage stakeholder participation. How do we manage these problems? How do we address illegal logging? How do we ensure sustainable use? The holdings of, there's a large segment of the forestry sector that's privately owned, and that these are relatively small parcels of land. So some of the interventions are the forest policy and strategy in Kosovo. This has been funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland and the FAO, and what that really seeks to do is to contribute to the forestry sector and leveraging that to really enhance the national economy, but doing so in a sustainable way so that these really rich forest resources are preserved. So in terms of water, we'll move on to water. Water quality is really the main, I would say, is the main issue, and ensuring that people have access to good water quality is the main issue in Kosovo. There was a survey done by UNICEF in 2014 that indicated that only 64% of the population has access to consistent, clean, and potable water, and that a lot of this is due to contamination of wells from industrial waste, and falling into water supply systems. And the contributing factors to this are inadequate management of water supply, management of sanitation systems, lack of wastewater treatment, and these really affect the quality of drinking water. And really, there are also there's a geographic dimension to this, that there's a disparity between urban and rural areas in terms of access to water. For example, 30% of those living in rural areas do not have access to tapped water. And this really affects, again, the most marginalized group, Roma population, other ethnic minorities, and women who have to gather water for household needs and for kitchen gardens and things like that. So the water, I will say that that the government of Kosovo seems to have made a really significant commitment to water quality in Kosovo, that although there's donor support, they've really allocated a significant, I think they provide nearly 25% of the total funding from the consolidated budget to really improve water management, improving water supplies and the availability of potable water, and that and really implementing what the document is, the policy document is the water sector strategy from 2015 to 2034, I believe. And really, the EU has been one of the largest donors supporting the sector. And a lot of this is based on parity and compliance with EU standards as the country considers EU accession, and they've done a lot to help with that process through their pre-accession assistance, the IPA funding. And then finally, minerals. So the mining sector really had a very rich history in Kosovo, but the capacity suffered due to neglect during the 1990s and then during the wartime. So there are, in terms of what Kosovo has, there's an abundance of nickel, lead, zinc. Let's see, some of the other ones are magnetite and other ores that, if developed, could really help be leveraged and make a significant contribution to the national economy. But really, the sector is constrained by an incomplete legal and regulatory environment, the problem of socially owned enterprises, the complexities of trying to privatize these and encourage investment, and the negative environmental effects. In other words, developing the mining sector, but making sure that there's appropriate cleanup, but that there's also environmental compliance in doing so. So in the coming years, by all accounts, the government is really going to be focusing on funding and rehabilitating existing mines, making more of the mines functional, and I would say trying to address the issue of socially owned enterprises. How does the government deal with that to encourage private investment? So the donor intervention in that sector really right now is primarily in the area of environmental cleanup, and the World Bank has funded land reclamation and cleanup activities there. So what should be recommended for the government in conclusion is to really improve the coordination of institutions around property rights, is to kind of settle the intergovernmental structures, harmonization of policies, working together. There's really an issue around land fragmentation. I didn't get a chance to talk much about the agricultural sector, but that sector is really constrained by small parcel size. Most farmers have something like less than 3 hectares of land, and so to really to improve efficiencies and to leverage the sector, to try to consider more fully land consolidation. But again, land consolidation is a mechanism that is really it's complex. It requires a lot of education. It requires continuation of registration of parcels and just community education. Support efforts to improve land management. So urban planning, with the proliferation of informal settlements, that urban planning should be supported, spatial planning should be supported. And then finally, really supporting the policy and strategy paper on forestry. Forestry is a very important sector. It's an important natural resource, and addressing many of the constraints, but also leveraging the possibilities, I think is really important to move forward. Kosovo has a lot of high value forest products, and those should be supported. And the time goes by really quickly, and so I'm just going to stop here and open it up for any questions.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Maureen. We have 2 questions.
Okay.
The first one is, can Kosovo's efforts to improve the cadastre serve as a model for other countries, and if so, how? And then the second question is, how to improve participation in forestry in Kosovo? Are there good models to help achieve that goal?
Okay, so the first question, actually there's been a good bit of research, and there's, I'll have to, actually he's in the bibliography, but there's been someone who has some literature that has really held up a model of some of the Western Balkans, and in particular Kosovo, as a really good model for post-conflict land administration. And I encourage if you see the profile. I'll also, Carol, if I have resources that I want to post up after is there a way I can do that? Like, for example, this particular bit of research on Kosovo is a good model of post.
Yeah, sure. Anyone who's participating will be happy to share out Maureen's materials with you. Okay,
great. So it actually, because it's put so much of a commitment, it made a policy commitment, but it also funded it. And I think that the fact that they did this, it's not a glamorous activity. Cadastral work is not glamorous, but it goes a long, long way into ensuring a whole range of other development activities can take place in a harmonious, sustainable way. So I will actually post that literature. And so improving participation in the forestry sector. So again, I think one of the key issues here is lack of registration of boundaries. There's a lot of contested areas, and there are lots of good models in terms of participatory forest management. Carol, I don't know if you have any Your scope of expertise is pretty broad in this area, if you can think of anything. But I think that the fact that these areas are contested, that the spaces are contested, they're in areas that are sensitive because they're on border areas, but also the fact that there's so much illegal logging activity, there has to be a way to negotiate use and access, but also value added instead of just clear cutting timber and selling it. If there were opportunities to add value to that timber, it would legitimize the sector and maybe not encourage that kind of illegal activity.
And giving them the ability to benefit from the use of those resources drives good outcomes in terms of conservation of resources, and in some cases in terms of climate change goals and
exactly.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Maureen. Well, we have one final question that's come in, and then I'll let you wrap things up for us, Maureen. And the final question we have this morning is, in terms of gender equality, what do you see as the most important next steps for Kosovo to take to help promote greater gender equality in the country?
So I think, as in, when we talk in terms of sequencing of land tenure and property rights activities, I think there's two things at work: is awareness, but also changing the culture around attitudes of women not only accessing but using and owning their own property. I think the laws that are in place are really helpful, but I really believe that this is that educating women about what their rights are. The research has shown, and practical experience has borne out, that when women, when they have this as a formal asset, they rarely mortgage their asset, they use it to their highest and best use, and they're very good stewards of this land, and it improves household outcomes, children's health, children's ability to access education. It just has a wide-ranging effect. And so I think that if women understand that this is a primary asset, if we improve their ability to access credit markets to obtain their land and enforce succession laws and inheritance laws, there's a really progressive inheritance law. It's just education, awareness, and enforcement. But if I had to pick one, I would pick education, and really getting women on board with how this can improve their lives and the lives of everyone in their household.
Great. Well, Maureen, thank you so much for joining us, and to our online audience, thank you so much for joining us in what we hope will be the first of a series of country-by-country profiles looking at the land tenure and property rights environment in countries around the world, sponsored by USAID's Land Office. To see the country profiles, please visit www.land-links.org/country profiles, and there you'll see dozens of country profiles that look at these issues in depth. Again, Maureen, thank you so much for being with us this morning. And again, thank you to our online audience for being with us this morning. I'll give you a brief heads up that we're looking forward to doing another country profile webinar on Tanzania in early December, and we hope that you'll join us for that. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.